One of my favorite novels is Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. In that novel, Setha, an enslaved black woman, pregnant and abused, escapes from a Kentucky plantation to cross the Ohio River to freedom. And she meets a white girl, Amy, who inexplicably helps her, for whites and blacks, of course, did not mix. And when Amy looses Setha's dress to relieve the pain in her back, she sees a tree-like mass of cuts, welts, and bruises and scabs on Setha's back, the result of merciless whippings from the slave master's lash. And upon seeing the scars of such brutality and the likelihood that Setha would not survive the ordeal of abuse and even escape, almost as if on impulse, Amy exclaims, "I wonder what God had in mind." It was an honest response, a mix of faith that God has to be present even in the midst of this pain and suffering, and frustration that such brutality could happen, if it can happen at all, if God was anywhere in the vicinity. Wonder what God had in mind that she would suffer this. Wonder what God had in mind. That's the question that goes over and over in my mind when I read this text. The rape of Tamar is a horrible and frustrating story of evil in which neither God's wrath nor God's goodness will save the day for Tamar. God's wrath or God's goodness will not redeem us in the hearing of this story. And although we rarely read this story in worship, it is a story we cannot ignore, for there is something familiar and timeless about it. Family dysfunction, destructive abuse of power, and sexual violence against the most vulnerable among us. And what makes it even more disheartening is that the one who has been abused and violated so brutally will not get the justice she deserves. The scholar Phyllis Tribble maintains that in this story, victory belongs to the fools. And she concludes that Tamar's suffering will go unrelieved. And how could this happen to Tamar? After all, she is the daughter of the great King David, the one to whom God made a covenant that his house and his kingdom would be made sure forever, that his throne would be established forever. Is this the nature of unaccountable power? Is this the example David set for his own son with his own covetous affair with Bathsheba and his murderous disposal of her husband? Could it be that David's own failure to act with honor and integrity sets the stage for his oldest son's fall into horrendous and merciless violence? And now, in David's own household, his own daughter, a young woman with less power and less status, becomes an object of the self-indulgent lust and obsession of an entitled son of the king. And she also becomes a pawn in an unprincipled fight in the politics of royal succession, acted upon and powerless. And the result? Amnon, Tamar's own brother, lusts after her, orchestrates a ruse to be alone with her, and forces himself on her. Tamar's her act of kindness by preparing the food for her brother, who she thinks is sick, her generous provision of sustenance to a sick brother is responded to with voyeurism and exploitation and harassment. Her act of kindness to her brother will be met with the evil of rape. And it's unfortunate, Tamar, although she has no power, she alone speaks. Oh, and the Bible is horrible. Most women don't get a chance to speak. But she alone speaks with wisdom, and she displays great courage under such a tasking issue. She tries everything she could to stop him. She tries everything she could think of to stop her brother from committing the crime, but she is clear and forceful in her protest. There is no mistaking her response in this. No! Do not do this. Do not do something so vile. There is no mistaking her response. And then, in the middle of this, I know she's frightened. I know she's frightened, she's scared, but she offered her best arguments for how such an act would dishonor them both, how this act would dishonor their own nation. She pleads with him to think about what they will both lose if he insisted upon doing this. She would lose any prospect of marriage and family, and he will lose his honor and his status and thus his name. She asks him to appeal to the king for some kind of acceptable alternative arrangement. And even in the face of her reason, and even in the face of her appeal for mercy, Amnon's will to power and the impunity of unquestioned entitlement will make him oppressed. Wonder what God had in mind. What is this story for? Why are we hearing it? Wonder what God had in mind. Amnon forced Tamar. Amnon raped Tamar. The writer of this text uses the word force, meaning Amnon oppressed and humiliated Tamar. Amnon used his power, social and physical, to demean and shame one who was weaker. And when he was done, he hated her and discarded her like a useless, inexpendable object. And the truth of Amnon's feeling, which was so ridiculously called, I don't know why the writer would even call it that, ridiculously called loved, has been revealed for what it truly is, hate. That is the truth of rape. It is hate. He hated her. He wanted nothing to do with her. He wanted who he hated out of sight and out of mind. And she pleaded with him to make it right. She pleaded with him to do justice, to prevent the horrible act that he committed from further victimizing her, from making her life desolate and lost. What do we do when we are violated, dehumanized, and acted upon so oppressively? Oh, see, for Tamar, there will be no trial, there will be no verdict, there will be no justice, there won't be a call to account, there won't be restitution, there won't be a happy ever after for her. And after all that happens, the text tells us that she remains desolate, alone, abandoned, her life ripped apart. She will live the rest of her days in the house of her brother Absalom. No family, no children of her own. I wonder what God had in mind. But here's the thing. Tamar did do the only thing she knew how to do. She bore witness to what happened to her. She put ashes on her head. She tore the long robe that she was wearing. She put her hand on her head, and she went away crying aloud as she went. Amnon wanted her to go away and stay hidden and silent. Her brother Absalom advises her to be quiet, even as he plots revenge against her rapist. Her father, the great king, does nothing to punish or call his son to account for his crime. Wonder what God had in mind. Not this. Not this, never this. And Tamar could have hidden away in shame and silence. She could have kept quiet, protecting David and the royal family from this shameful behavior. She could have acted to protect her father's name and her brother's future. She could have blamed herself. She could have punished herself. She could have lived in denial about it all. But not Tamar. She summoned the courage to tell the truth about what happened to her. She lamented openly for all to see. She tore her clothes so they would know. She cried aloud and said, "This happened to me." And in the end, Tamar's cries will be forgotten and her pain will become lost in the battle over the throne. She will live the rest of her life with the betrayal of all the men in her life, all the men that she trusted, who failed her in their conspiracy of silence. But here's the thing, church. Since Tamar was courageous enough to bear witness to the violence and the injustice she suffered, we must be courageous enough to hear her cries. We must be courageous enough to share the burden of her pain. Just because David, Amnon, and Absalom sought to silence her doesn't mean that we have to allow her suffering to be forgotten. We will not be complicit in a conspiracy of silence about rape. Not here. We won't be silent about it. Not us. And so I don't think we have to wonder what God had in mind. This kind of evil does not befit the generous God whose covenant loyalty is faithful and steadfast. God never has in mind that God's children will be violated. I believe that God is right there in Tamar's unbearable grief and her debilitating pain. God is in there, right there in her courage and in her will to bear witness to what has been done to her. God is protesting right along with her. No, not this. Head on. To face both sexual violence and to hear the cries of the victims of sexual violence. I don't think we have to wonder what God had in mind. There is no spiritual lesson that God is trying to teach us here. There is no redemptive suffering that God calls us to endure here. There is no compensatory religion that's going to be found in this kind of violence. The only thing that we have to do is call out evil. That is our job. To call out the evil, and we must take up the calls of all of the Tamars of every age, every sex, every race, every religion, every ethnicity, and every sexual orientation who have been raped, assaulted, or harassed. We take up their cause. I take up that cause for the 18-year-old DeWayne, who finally free to date, goes on a date, and someone more powerful forces himself upon him. And I yell, "No, no, don't do this." I was fortunate enough to get away. And as I was going away, I blamed myself. I started hearing all the words of, "You shouldn't have been there. You failed." And because I was gay, I couldn't tell people that. I said no. Why? I was one of the fortunate ones. I was able to get out before I could be forced. But no more silence. No conspiracy of silence. Our families, our communities, our society have all been dishonored and diminished because of rape. Silence and denial have compounded the brokenness and the injustice. But somewhere, somebody is bearing witness to the injustice with their cries. Somewhere, somebody is trying to tell us about the evil that we are too afraid to hear. There are so many more Tamars putting ashes on their heads and tearing their robes and crying aloud in hopes that we will hear it, in hopes that we will join them in telling the truth about this evil, in hopes that we will make things right. I pray that we will stand up and defend and protect and advocate for them. Because I believe that that is what God has in mind. Amen.